in the late 20th century, a conference of the Federal Foundation for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship in Eastern Germany in Berlin. We are very close to the Embassy of Korea. On the way here, I saw it, and now we will talk about broken systems, international perspectives on experiences of transformation of societies as a whole, but also of individuals. This is what we are going to talk about with Ulrike Capdepón. She is a political scientist at the University of Konstanz. At the moment, she works in Mexico. It is very early in the morning there. Thank you for getting up so early. And she does research on processes of culture of remembrance and wrote a book about Pinochet and people who disappeared during the civil war, about dictatorship and civil rights violations in Chile and Spain. She does research on human rights and the processing of dictatorships and mass violence. Marina Frenk is with us. She was born in 1986 in Chisinau in the Moldavian Socialist Soviet Republic. At 7 years, she came to Germany as a quota refugee. And since then, she has been dealing with the history of her own family and with the history of flight and displacement and dictatorship. She is an actor and an author, lives in Berlin, and we will quote one of her books later. We've got here Dr. Steffen Mau. He was born in Rostock in the former GDR. He is now professor of macro sociology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He deals with inequality research and comparative welfare state research with political sociology and sociology. And then I've got a long list of topics he deals with. But what I found particularly interesting was that you participated in the 9th of November 1989 as a soldier. And we've got Dr. Khulu Mbatha. He is the special advisor on international relations of the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. His biography is very special. He was part of the ANC for 25 years. He lived abroad and came back to South Africa only after the liberation of Nelson Mandela. He was, among others, a diplomat in Munich and Germany, and still cooperates with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He critically dealt with what followed the apartheid and wrote a book, Unmasked, while the ANC failed to govern. And I'm going to ask him about that. And Mr. Mbatha, I would like to start with you. Can you describe briefly the moment when you decided for yourself that against all odds, you're going to become part of the ANC, and what is your conclusion? What happened to this movement after the end of the regime and apartheid?
Thank you. Let me start by saying apartheid in South Africa, the system, was the practice of an outmoded colonial system that involved gross racial segregation and denial of basic human rights. It is against apartheid that the people of South Africa revolted, and they engaged in an armed struggle to achieve their freedom and their right to self-determination. There are three significant factors among many others, which contributed to the downfall of the apartheid regime. One, the internal escalation of the opposition to apartheid by the black masses of South Africa inside the country. Two, the impact of economic sanctions by several countries on South Africa, including the anti-apartheid movement. Three, the collapse of the socialist system in Eastern Europe, which included the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The ANC was a major political force for change in South Africa and a source of inspiration to many struggles across the globe. The leadership of Nelson Mandela during this time prevailed, and he guided us to find a negotiated settlement instead of a prolonged bloodbath. The success of the peaceful negotiations shocked the whole world as these arch rivals found common ground and agreed to the holding of the first national democratic elections in 1994. For a divided people like we were, a new flag flew at the inauguration of President Nelson Mandela, symbolizing hope for a bright future in a united nation. The crowning of this process was the adoption of a new constitution by the Constitutional Assembly in 1996. This constitution became the supreme law when President Mandela signed it on 10 December in 1996. Now, the three main values of the Constitution of our sovereign and democratic state are human dignity, the achievement of quality and the advancement of human rights and freedom. 2, non-racialism and non-sexism. 3, the supremacy of the Constitution. Also in 1996, the Government of National Unity established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help deal with the past, that is, the human rights abuses from all sides. The TRC was chaired by the retired Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The TRC's main purpose, it was to promote reconciliation and forgiveness among the perpetrators and victims of apartheid by full disclosure of the truth of what happened. There are conflicting views about its success and failures. In broad terms, it did succeed as many victims and perpetrators participated and found each other. There are still many who have not found closure about what happened in the past. One of its weaknesses of the
Herr
TRC...
Mbatha, darf ich Sie dazu gleich was fragen?
Yes.
Mr. Mbatha, can I ask you something about this? This was really a historic moment. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not come about right away, but just a few years after the independence of the state. And earlier in the conference, we asked the question whether there can be one single factor for a society to leave behind itself a dictatorship. Would you say that it is not possible without such a commission to develop further as a society?
Let me say that both transformation and, in our case, transformation begins before the elections. It means it takes many, many negotiations between the two arch rivals to come to the conclusion. So it takes time. In South Africa, it took about four to 5 years, although Mandela had started with negotiations. And then the success of such negotiations determines the form of reconciliation that follows. It might not be the case in all countries, but in our case, thanks to the fact that it was agreed beforehand that there will be a government of national unity. So the government of national unity, it was the first time in our country because we saw the same people who oppressed us becoming now ministers. Now, it was clear that we needed something else to make sure that this message goes to the people. And that's why, under the leadership of President Mandela, they came up with a proposal that we should have a truth and reconciliation. Also, it's a process. As you correctly said, it does not start immediately. There are a few years because then we had to find a constitution. Then it starts thereafter. And it lasted also to about 4 to 5 years. It was a painful process. Like I say,
Frau Capdepón würde ich gerne dazu fragen. Sie forschen ja an Gesellschaften.
I would like to pass the floor to Mrs. Capdepón because you're doing research on societies which try to leave behind their dictatorships. What is your analysis? What happens if societies don't establish truth and reconciliation commissions? Thank you very much. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa was trailblazing, but it based on experiences from South America, from the Chilean Reconciliation Commission of 1991, and other similar commissions like the CONEDAT in Argentina. These were experiences that influenced the Commission of Africa. What happens if such predecessors do not exist? I deal with Spain. I do research on Spain, and in Spain there never was such a Reconciliation and Truth Commission. And the demand to establish such a commission is there only since about the year 2000. Today, there is a massive need for such a commission. These commissions try to create a different narrative about history, about the human rights violations that happened, and about crimes that can no longer be denied. This never happened in Spain. Until today, the right-wing parties of Spain not unequivocally distanced themselves from the dictatorship and from the human rights violations. If there was such a commission in Spain, things would have turned out differently. I don't want to draw a negative country of Spain. There are many similar initiatives on the local level, for example. At the beginning of the transition process, for example, there was a historians commission with dealt with the crimes that happened in Guernica, a Basque town that was bombed by National Socialists in 1938, and there is a commission dealing with these crimes, for example, in the Basque region, but also in other Spanish regions. There are other commissions dealing with crimes during the Civil War, during the Franco dictatorship, but not on the national level, and this has a lot of consequences, particularly that until today, there is no divided narratives about condemning these crimes. Mr. Mao, here I would like to include you into our discussion. You speak about fractures of society, in particular when you talk about the new federal state. What do you mean with this? What I mean is much broader than just reconciliation with history. I mean also demographic questions, questions of social inequality, or questions of cultural declassification. But the policy of history and remembrance plays an important role in this process. What is interesting about the German case is that we had an enquete commission about the reappraisal of the communist dictatorship. Just a short time ago, we had the 60th anniversary of the building of the Berlin Wall, and this was an important topic in the media. At the same time, I sometimes have the feeling that the official historical policy is not interesting for the vast majority in East Germany. And some say that there is a divided perception. There's one perception in the media and in the official parts of Germany, and on the other hand, there is the population which perceives things completely differently. So questions just as the oppression of dissidents, of people who died when they tried to climb over the Berlin Wall. These memories are very often not spoken about openly, and people who lived in the GDR sometimes prefer their own history and do not share the official view of the state. The GDR was a dictatorship. However, people very often did not perceive it as such, and the experiences, personal experiences or family experiences, are not in the focus of the official reappraisal. Of course, this is not the task of such a commission, but such writers as Ilko Sasha Kowalczuk, for example, wrote about the fact that the reconciliation, the reappraisal process was carried out without the participation of the population. And I think it would be interesting to see in how far those who lived in the GDR perceive places of memory, if they visited such places such as prisons. I don't know any concrete data, but it would be interesting to get to know how many people who lived in the former GDR really visited such places or memorials. And if we knew that, we could ask whether the reconciliation process was sufficient and whether it is necessary to confront people with this history.
Festgehalten wurden, verhört wurden.
Well, I can confirm that in Hohenschönhausen, where people were detained and investigated, it's a very oppressive place. You're not asked, of course, when you come in, whether you are from the east or the west. But remembrance, well, it is always linked to many personal memories. Perhaps you can describe your personal 9th of November 1989, which most of us know as a historical date. Well, of course, everyone who's experienced it knows what you've done on that date. I was a soldier. I did my national service. I was stationed in Schwerin. For us, it was actually the days before the 9th of November that were decisive. That was when the demonstrations started to commemorate the GDR's existence. And you did ask yourself, some serious questions of conscience. What do we do if the lorries start rolling and you have to jump on and you have to use your rifle, your Kalashnikov? On the 9th of November, I woke up. We had a little illegal radio, which we weren't allowed to have. And it was a grey, miserable day. And so we passed this little radio to one another. And we listened to Ria's radio station, which was very interesting. I heard about Checkpoint Charlie, and there was a smart commentator who said, the wall is open, that's the end of the GDR. Of course, we didn't realize this that evening, but we did notice that there was this tectonic shift and that things maybe wouldn't stay the way they were. But I should add, way before that, the GDR was spent economically, morally, and politically. Of course, it was also spent, and there was a phase of notable stagnation all the way to the mass migration movement leaving the GDR. And I was in my early 20s, especially my generation, then was no longer willing to participate in the system of the GDR, and people obviously weren't willing anymore to support this regime. Marina, Frenk, you were 3 years old on that day. From your perspective, can you tell us what this does to family biographies? You weren't part of this historical development yourself directly, but it still influenced and shaped your life. Yeah, definitely. We emigrated in 1993, so a little bit later. So, yeah, absolutely. I didn't really understand what was happening. I did realize from the conversations my parents had that there was a big change. But for me, it was mostly really through the lives of my parents. It's really a memory that's constantly present, a life that no longer exists. The memories were also quite different. Some of them negative, some of them positive. Just like life really contains everything. And there were many conversations questioning the point of that system, what was good about it, what was bad about it, and what it means if you are kind of made to switch from one life to another. And when the present is often just this hole that exists that you fall into. So it was really the stories of my parents and their friends who were also quota refugees. So that's the image I had, really. But it's something that stayed with you throughout your life because it dominates your work, doesn't it? So you engage with that past continuously. Is that really ruptures in the biographies of your parents, or is it a whole community that you're surrounded by? Or how come that you have chosen this as your personal topic? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, from 2015 to 2020 was my big topic because I somehow engaged with that family history. Through theatre, some of my monologues were completely autobiographical at the Maxim Gorky Theatre. It was really part of the post-migrant topic. There's also a novel, which is not a complete autobiography. It's a kind of a bit of both. It's really how I dealt with something that happened a while ago. That's also the title of the book. And I think it was Mr. Ma, what was the previous panel? And it's true that these processes are just never over. They're never really concluded. So I believe that it'll stay with me for the rest of my life, this whole process of reconciliation. I think it's just kind of stuck in my brain. These are things that I've heard too many times, maybe, or have spent too much time thinking about it. Is it maybe a good thing that there was a closed system? Maybe there was a positive aspect to it in contrast to democracy. So of course it did something to me. Is this a good point that you could maybe read a stretch from your novel? Yes, it's a dialogue between the main protagonist and their friend, and I chose it because this is about terms like system. And the protagonist is from Moldavia, and the friend is from the former GDR, and they are trying to explore the purpose, the point of these two systems. Well, socialism wasn't a stupid idea, but it was only just a system. Systems are like tunnels or something. People walk through a tunnel that has many bends, but then returns to the starting point. You walk back and forth in this labyrinth, but if you manage to look at it from above at some point, all you see is a system. The work of the day consists of somehow crossing that labyrinth, physically and mentally. With the system in your head, you move through the system of the head and nothing more. That's one person is saying. Then the next person says, but it's interesting to invent a system, isn't it? Yeah, like the little mole. He always had ideas too. Ideas can be solutions or pointless. So an idea that is meant to be the purpose in itself doesn't really exist, doesn't work. Okay. Do you want to comment on this? Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a scientific perspective at all. This novel is auto-fiction. It's an attempt, so to speak, really to approach the term system. Mbatha, systems as tunnels. People walking through tunnels. These are accumulated biographical ruptures, if you like, when there's a system change. In South Africa, it has clearly changed for the better. Can you describe maybe also when certain disappointments perhaps also began to accumulate in people? Mr. Mbatha, you have to unmute yourself, please. Yes, perfect.
That's it. No worries.
Let me start with what Mandela said. after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. Now, freedom, we fought for over 82 years. That's how old the ANC was in 94. The ANC was also banned for 30 years outside the country. It was quite clear that whilst the negotiations were very successful, as they were not expected to produce the results they produced. Going into government was the biggest challenge that the ANC has ever faced. The results of that are only clear today. It should be clear to all of us that liberation movements don't have the time while they are struggling to produce skilled personnel to run a government. The ANC, while it knew that it had to have skilled people, it did not prepare for this. So when it came into power, that's when even President Mandela said he was shocked by the caliber of people that we had. In other words, the challenge is that of the transition, both physically calling for skills to manage governance, but also the influence of ideologies that have influenced the struggle up to that time. So the biggest challenge is that we have not been able to turn the economy of South Africa to produce equality among its own people. It means people today feel very betrayed by the mere fact that their lives have not become better. It has been very difficult for the ANC to acknowledge that they have to do things differently. But I'm happy that today we are reaching a stage where it is quite clear that we need to train people for a new South Africa that can service all its people, black and white, colors and Indians. For now, we can say the quality of leadership has not been the same. The policies that have been produced by the ANC have not changed the economic conditions, both of colors and whites, which means black South Africans today see whites as continuing with the life they had before 94. And it brings anger among the people to see that their own conditions, the houses being service on water and so on, unemployment is the highest among black people. So they see that their lives have not changed.
Frau Capdepón, Sie forschen auch dazu, zu Eliten.
Ms. Capdepón, you also do research on elites, on exchanges between elites. What impact does that have in other countries? We talked about Spain beforehand. Yeah, elites, that elite, it's very important to include the elites in such discussions. In Spain, just like Mr. Mbatha just described, the transition process and the pact that was agreed first brought great euphoria. And then there was this kind of sobering period and a sense of hopelessness. when different continuities then led to the new situation, linking back to the old. And when we talk about elites, there's at least there wasn't an exchange of elites in Spain. So we had that process that was agreed upon, so the elites actually were able to secure their positions by making a pact with one another. But there's a term in Spanish coined by Vasquez Montalbán, who is actually an author, just like Marina Frenk. He actually writes novels, and it's a term of which is really about describing the continuity of elites. So ethically and legally in Spain, there's still impunity based on an amnesty law of 1967. And as I said, ethically, there is no condemnation of the crimes that occurred during the Franco regime. So that means those who are the economic profiteers of the Franco regime, of course, they have no interest in any dealing with the past or in any official reconciliation. So, yes, continuity with the Franco dictatorship is being referred to, and that's related to corruption in political parties, for example, or the judicial apparatus, which is still in the Franco tradition. One example is the legal scandal when Baltasar Garzón, a judge, was ousted in 2012. He actually wanted to look at the Franco regime's crimes, and he then became a victim of the justice system. He was ousted from his position. Another element is the survival of Franco-based structures, mentalities, and so on. So these are the elements that are being discussed today, at least, and are being criticized, including the factors responsible for the continuity of Franco structures.
Ms. Damau, you wrote that with the collapse of the GDR collapsed into the lap of the Federal Republic of Germany. So the economic consequences were much less severe than the impact on individual fates. Why is there still such a big problem of elites, or why is there this shadow on the German relationships? People in Warsaw, in Chisinau or Sofia were envious of what happened in Germany, the reunification with a powerful partner, the Federal Republic of Germany. This had very specific advantages. The purchasing power, for example, increased in a very short time. However, this destabilized large parts of the society. It decreased the industry, and many companies which were not competitive were closed. The disadvantage was that the GDR was an unsorted society without free media, without a large public, without civil society. And if such a society becomes part of another society, which happened willfully, then this means that they are not able to carry out their transition themselves, but puts it into other hands. The Society of East Germany was exogenous. It became the money. It got money from the West. Institutions were transferred from the West into the East. So there was no necessity of inner societal negotiations, and the discussion constitution stopped. And the third was the transfer. And this has a specific influence on the culture of remembrance. Some say that the GDR did not have a 1968. That means a dealing with the crimes of the Third Reich, and there was also no conflict between the generations when it comes to the dictatorship or the state socialism. And this is a very specific disadvantage. Why was it so? Often such generational discourses have the consequence that new elites develop, that younger elites develop and find their own place. Of course, in East Germany, there was a discourse between older and younger elites. However, dissidents and active civilians very quickly had to leave the active places, and of course they participated in the process of reconciliation. However, they were not able to get to the central places of power, with some exceptions. That means that these elites became professional elites for the professional reconciliation. And what I see as critical is they perceive themselves as gatekeepers. They think that they've got the prerogative of saying what may be said and how things have to be interpreted. I know that this is a contested view. However, I still would like to present this opinion. I think that a processing of the Stasi and other things were carried out in a very positive way. But why did the generations not carry out such a debate? Why did people who were 10 at the time of the reunification, or even younger, why didn't they not ask their parents, what was your responsibility in the socialist state? Where did you participate? Why did you oppose? What was your opinion? What did your workplace look like? I think that these questions weren't asked often enough. Why? The younger generation of the GDR experienced a very large pressure. People experienced mass unemployment, and this was a broken generation. That there was a large generation that was no longer in the powerful positions of society, and they were even pushed out of their positions. And the younger generation very often took on a caring function. They care for their parents, they support their parents, they see how their parents suffered from the events, and they did not want to put their parents under additional pressure and ask questions that should be asked. And I would like, if you allow, to name another aspect, and that is that the GDR was no longer a single society. It became part of a larger country. And that means that each kind of discussion and the pluralism of voices was always happening in front of a larger society of West Germany, which often knew better. You probably remember the scandals of the 90s, the many people who worked for the state security. And if somebody started to become successful, somebody from East Germany, then people looked instantly whether they participated in activities of the state security. And for example, when Angela Merkel became more popular as a politician, she was vetted checked very closely. And so there was this pressure. And one last point, and here I agree with Mrs. Capdepón, is the question of elites. There were no longer functioning elites in East Germany. Now, 30 years after the reunification, we've got only a very small Eastern German elite. It is a little bit bigger in politics, but in the legal authorities, in the media, in science, universities, in the arts, East German elite positions remained vacant. So the federal German elites are free of East Germans. So who is there to lead this debate? Who is there to talk about their past? We need people who represent this debate in the media, and this did not happen, but it would have been necessary in order to present this debate to the East German society. But what happened, in fact, was a debate without the population, and I think that this had a large influence. Maybe I exaggerate a little bit, but I want to make obvious what is the reason why in some parts we were very successful with our transition and in others we weren't. Mr. Mao, I would like to ask one more question. Tomorrow, Mrs. Boysen will be a moderator. She wrote a biography of Angela Merkel, and she is a very good person to argue how Angela Merkel used the space that she got to do something that was not part of the system. There's a question from the audience, and I would like to ask you to ask your questions. We will pass them on to our participants. Mr. Mao, somebody asked, is it really true that in other systems, new elites got into the positions of the old ones? And maybe this is also a question to Mrs. Capdepón. Not in general. Mrs. Capdepón also pointed out that sometimes there's a continuity of elites. Sometimes elites also change. When I look at the system of the oligarchs in Russia or in other Eastern European societies, then the new elites are the old elites. In other countries, the situation looks different. Orban, for example, is a politician who comes from the opposition. Whether he became an elite that we support, that we like, is a different question. But in the GDR, there was a large discontinuity of elites between 1945 and the foundation of the GDR. And there's also a study which shows that the elites changed very fundamentally between the Weimar Republic and the beginning of the Federal Republic of Germany. Or rather the other way around, the elites remained the same, but in the GDR, the elites changed. In other countries, in Poland, for example, or in the Czech Republic with Václav Havel as president, people got into the elite from the dissident movement. Lech Wałęsa in Poland was a dissident, a member of the opposition who got into a central political position. And if I look at the website of the federal government, then I see people as Genscher, as Willy Brandt and others, and people, old politicians who are going to celebrate the 3rd of October. There is nobody from East Germany. And this shows that the GDR was more or less incorporated, or the remains of the GDR. And that is why the picture of collapsing into the lap of another state is quite right. I would like, before I come back to you, Mrs. Capdepón, Mrs. Frenk, you nodded a lot when we said that the old elites remain. Is this the experience of your parents? You described a system as something where people are trapped, and the scene that you presented to us does not represent the idea that an individual can change a system. Well, the question is whether you can change something in a system which is in your head. But of course, it was only a small part of my book, and I hope it became clear what I wanted to say. But what I learned from the older generation, from the Soviet Union was a large country. I mean, Moldova, I maybe will read out something else. But what the independence of a small country which was occupied means is that systems can be anchored in the head of the population so rigidly that this can even be transported to the next generation. And for the younger generation, it is very difficult to understand that things can look differently.
I press the cushion into my face. I press it into my memory. I was early 20 when I flew to Küfner on my own for the first time. I got off the aeroplane and watched the other people on the bus to the terminal. Many seemed as if arriving in their country was a national celebration. They seemed proud, easy, and I admired them because I didn't feel anything, just the same sense of being an alien. I stood in the airport and I forgot that Moldavia was not part of the EU. It was burning almost. There was a bang. I moved forward to the passport control and began to pray. The EU solves trade problems. The EU creates spaces that help us stabilize ourselves. The EU is the main trade partner to our country. Why is the EU doing this? Because it has a heart, because it draws so much money from Moldavia, because it can sell its rubbish on our market. I moved the cushion from my face and gasped for air. My parents prophesied that if I still lived in the Soviet Union, I would have to be a washer-upper somewhere. Some people can foresee the future. My parents can see a present that doesn't exist based on a past that never existed. Of course, here is much better. It's better to buy products from China than producing these goods in Moldavia. But in Moldavia, I would do exactly what I do now. Make art by throwing up onto a canvas. I still stood in the queue for the passports and was dreading its end. I tried to feel like someone else. I was good at that. I was able to transform myself as a child because I got lost on the beach once. I continued to pray. The EU is the main trade partner of Moldavia because the EU can sell rubbish on its markets. My parents are right. Russia says if you cooperate with the EU, we're no longer buying your wine. But Moldavia only sells wine. If you sidle up to Europe, we no longer buy your wine. As far as Moldavians are concerned, most people want the EU as their mother and the rest, the Russian Trade Federation as a father. Does Moldavia really want to be independent? The EU creates room for trade and bite into the pillow. No, I don't carry my passport on me, only my ID card. Were you really born here? Somebody asked me at passport control. Yes, I was. They grin. And why did you give up your citizenship? Because I am DDUN, a definitive idiot without an identity. My mother is Russian, my father is Jewish. Okay, she didn't have a clue. They made me spend a night at the airport and then flew back. A few months later, I returned with a passport, knowing that Moldavia was really something different, not just Europe. It still is as it is. At some point, it'll probably be Russia again because it's too small to be an independent state. Okay, I mean, what this tries to express is really, I guess, the ruptures that went on within these families. So it's really the broken family, the Jewish side, the Russian side. The Russian side has been part of the military. There's an officer who survived the war. He's been the hero in family law. It probably was because Russians came all the way to Germany and somehow won the war, but didn't at the same time. The Jewish side, there I learned a lot about anti-Semitism that was prevalent in the Soviet Union. It was an everyday thing also after the Second World War. So it wasn't just about the Germans as Nazis and the Romanians also. The family I'm describing in my book also has Romanian grandparents. They had to flee to Uzbekistan to survive the war and so on and so on. So it's really this whole story that where there is no moment of stability. That is what I tried to understand and convey. But I want to focus on Moldavia as a country. But we could equally talk about Belarus or Ukraine. What's happening in Belarus under Lukashenko is really a boiling over of old problems. And the question is there going to be a solution? Will it improve? Will journalists be released? Is this dictatorship somehow coming to an end? All these things are still in the process. None of that has come to an end. And as far as Moldavia is concerned, of which I'm not part of, really, I don't have a Moldavian in my family, so I really am this idiot without nationality. That's what it's like after the political change. Moldavia now is a hugely poor country that is somehow exploited by the EU. So that brings us to problems with capitalism, but also this is what happened to small former Soviet Union states. It did continue to destabilize them even further. Okay, so what is the role that is played by Soviet Union nostalgia when you were growing up? And is there any remnants of that in the form of certain traditions? Yeah, there's lots of nostalgia that I heard from my parents. Strangely, my parents have lots of positive memories of the Soviet Union, most probably because they weren't politically active. They were pretty apolitical, even though I think there aren't any apolitical people. We're all part of the larger political system, and we somehow behave somehow. And as an artist, there's also the question, do you take a stance or don't you? So I heard a lot of nostalgia, which I questioned and still question, because I think there's plenty of gaps in that story. Mr. Mbatha, I have a question to you from the audience. Apart from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996, were there any further approaches of non-state actors, for example, towards reconciliation, and what further step would you have liked to see? Mr. Mbatha, you have to unmute yourself, please. That's it.
Before I come to that, let me just say in a sentence that elites are always there to lead society, especially in times of change. And change is difficult without having elites. But elites are not one uniform group because they come from different backgrounds. And each and every epoch produces its own elite. And that's why after some time, when events have happened, an elite loses its relevance and their influence becomes questionable. That's why in a system where there is democracy, you have now the opportunity to bring about change, because the elite will never be the same all the time. I've seen that in my own country. Now, to come to your question, yes, in South Africa, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I know many people who did not want to go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because they said they have experience. They had such bitter experience with the system, the killings, the maiming, and incarceration in prison. They didn't want to have anything to do with reconciliation. But we had initiatives that were taken by non-governmental organizations, which were very much helpful in starting reconciliation processes. Like Mrs. Capdepón explained that we had non-governmental organizations that went outside the country to gather some experiences in other countries, in Latin America, in Europe. How can we bring about reconciliation? And this helped a lot because the NGOs were able to reach out even outside towns, in the villages, to go and bring, reconciliation. It goes not with preaching. You have to try and help the villagers to address the conditions in which they live. So these NGOs, they brought projects that would help the people to be self-sufficient in the terms of their livelihood. So this helped a lot.
Frau Capdepón, da komme ich noch mal zu Ihnen.
Ms. Capdepón, let me come back to you. What can you tell us about elites? Do they really kind of then have these discontinuities? Is it true that every era has its own elites, like Mr. Mbatha said? Yeah, on the question of elites, yes, at some point there's generational change. So there's also a natural change of elites. In Spain, for example, nothing was forced. That exchange of elites was not forced. If at all, certain military personnel were retired from the 1980s onwards. And because of generation change, also in the judiciary system, for example, new judges came into position. The same happened in Chile. That then made judicial reform possible in the first place, that generational change. So, in that sense, if there is no exchange of elites at the point of system change, then certain traditions are kind of passed on and they survive democratization, I would say. And that's the danger that results from the lack of exchanging elites. Nevertheless, in Spain and also in Latin America, after 45 years, 45 years after the death of Franco, it is no longer possible to speak of clear continuity. Of course, there is also a kind of creeping exchange of elites, yes. But still, also because there was this pact to keep silent, because there was a pact to not talk about human rights violations, so this pact of silence and also this consensus to collectively keep silent on certain things, at least that's the story that's being told. Well, that process, that pact also, of course, led to the situation that there's been no reconciliation and that there are certain asymmetries. 36 years of the Franco dictatorship made sure that society has remained divided. So there are opposing narratives to this day, and there's no consensus really on condemning the dictatorship. So, yeah, it's dramatic because, yeah, I mean, keeping silent on the past, keeping silent on the dictatorship means that traumas can also be traded. Intergenerational problems arise. And it has been impossible for a long time to actually really somehow engage with that dictatorship. So the politics of remembrance was very one-sided. It concentrated on the dead of the Franco. On Franco's side, it glorified the Franco dead in every place, in every town. There was a plaque for those who died in the Civil War. they died for God and for Spain, whilst remembrance of the victims of the Republican side was prohibited. So that's an asymmetry that is still present in today's Spain. So there's that continuity. And well, the tip of the iceberg kind of is the Valley of the Fallen. That's a place where, up until recently, Francisco Franco, the dictator himself, was buried, and with him, almost 34,000 Republican victims. And that place really is explosive to Spain's society, and only now, these days, it is being re-signified. So a new law has been passed, the law of democratic remembrance. It builds on another law dating back to 2007, and it's an extension, really, which enables this Valley of the Fallen to be rededicated. It was the place of remembrance for the Franco supporters par excellence, shall we say. So now this is being rededicated, reshaped somehow. I can tell you more if you like. Let me just ask you, for God and for Spain, the question there is, what is the role of the Catholic Church when it comes to reconciliation? And what about the Spanish kings?
Das ist natürlich also angefangen damit, dass im Prinzip.
Let me start with saying that the Catholic Church was a supporter of the dictatorship. There was the ideological construct of national Catholicism, and so it was quite natural that the Catholic Church as such was not interested in the democratization or in dealing with the past and the crimes that happened. And it still sticks to many Frankist narratives. Although, and I definitely have to add this, the Catholic Church is no monolith, but in particular during the transition, there were very many progressive forces within the church. There were priests who supported the poor. There were publications of the Catholic Church with the Second Vatican Concilium that supported a democratization and a critical dealing with how the Catholic Church supported Franco's dictatorship. However, until today, there is the parts of the Catholic Church still support these other narratives. The Valley of the Fallen, for example, is still belonging to a monastery, and they don't want it to become a memorial to be changed. And this monastery is also in charge of the archives, and this makes it very difficult to find out who died in this valley. About 12,000 people, and the remains of about 12,000 people are said to be buried there, and these are the remains of people who disappeared, who were not identified. And with the help of the laws on remembrance, Spain tries to move this monastery out of this valley and to cope with the past. In the GDR, the church was a sanctuary, and we received a question via email. How did the system of unofficial supporters of the Stasi characterize the Eastern German society? Are the East Germans more mistrustful than the West Germans? And maybe also in terms of state structures? Both in terms of the state and in terms of other parts of the society. On the one hand, the GDR was a state which did not perceive its citizens as individuals and responsible people, and there was a gap between state institutions and the population, and these are things that could not be changed overnight. But the role of the state security, I am not an expert on the state security, and it's incredibly difficult to, there are many debates. Mr. Wanderwitz, the Federal Commissioner for the new federal states, just recently asked the question, how did the dictatorship coin the society, and whether the fact that there is such a large support of right-wing parties in East Germany, whether this can be referred to the experience of a dictatorship is a difficult question. And also the debate whether the GDR was an illegitimate state is a difficult one. Many people in the East would say, yes, it was an illegitimate state, but not only. So this not only is something that also has to be told when it comes to politics of remembrance. But it is concealed very often, although for the biographies of the people and for their identity, it played an important role. And that is, if we talk about a society that it cannot be reduced to just superficial labels, I think that these debates are not very fruitful. Of course, the GDR society was also characterized by the state security, the politics of mistrust, of control, of conspiracy is something that was not just a side effect of the GDR or of its population, but something that also constituted the population and the state. It was one of the basis of the stability of the state. And for some people, this had consequences in a way that they are very skeptical in terms of all kinds of surveillance by the state, face recognition, video cameras in public spaces. But it also led to the opposite, to a tolerance against such effects, such things. I am always skeptical. Now, 30 years after the reunification, we can't say that the events that happened then have a direct impact on what is going on now, because the 30 years that passed also had their impact, and probably the experience of the transition is much more important for the younger generation than the experience with the state security earlier. But what I believe, what continued is that there was a weak civil society. All data show that East Germany has less associations, foundations, a smaller civil society. Of course, there are less foundations. There's much less capital in the East, and also a weaker establishment of parties, except for the left or the AfD, but other parties have fewer members in the East, and that characterizes the political culture in the regions. And this has to do with the history, but also with the time after the reunification, and that it is not that easy to find simple causes for the question why we don't have the same structures here as we have in Rhineland-Palatinate, for example. In some parts, there are different societies with specific problems. In East Germany, it still is a problem that the democratic culture and the civil society is less well developed. And this holds true probably not only for East Germany, but probably also for Moldova, Hungary, or the Czech Republic. So there are different attitudes towards liberal values. There are different milieux, social structures. The East German society is still a society of small people, of simple people. There are many pensioners. The society is much older than in the West. This is also true for Eastern European countries. Many younger people left the region. In some regions, 1/4 or even 1/3 of the population left the country. And these were the young, the active, the flexible people. And this, of course, means that some things don't move or develop as quickly as we would like it to see. In Bulgaria, Mrs. Frenk described it in a wonderful way, the role of market formation in these countries. This is very important. If you drive through Romania, you see companies who work there who come from West German countries. You can find supermarkets or other companies from the West. And of course, this has a destructive effect on the local structures, on the economies, and also on the identities of the people. And I think if we talk to people from Moldova or from Romania, then they say we were part of the Soviet Empire, now we are independent, and now the EU has come. And this, of course, changes these societies. If you get the feeling that you are just a shop where people can sell their products and a chance for the market development of Western European companies, then this changes societies. And I think that we sometimes forget that societies do not only depend on markets, but also have to find ways of dealing with the past, of accumulating capital, of developing. And the question, what is the reason and what the consequence, is not the most important question. Things are very complicated. Oh, they definitely are. And then there is one contradiction I would like you to analyze. In the GDR, people always said that there were no more fascist ideologies in the society. So something that was processed in the West was said not to have existed in the GDR at all. But now the right-wing AfD has its largest support in the East. How can you explain this? The GDR was an anti-fascist state. Many of its official representatives were people who were suppressed under National Socialism. But on the other hand, there was no break with the past. There were people who had high positions in the National Socialist regime, and there were also forms of nationalism in the GDR, the first socialist state on German grounds. The GDR did not perceive itself as a cosmopolitan state. This was part of its nation branding, and also against the background of system confrontation. And in the 80s, I myself saw that there was a very strong right wing scene from Rostock to Karl-Marx-Stadt, which was very deeply rooted in the society. And this was something that was not dealt with in society because according to the official doctrine, there was no right-wing extremism. So the problem was downplayed and was not dealt with. And it is quite easy to say that that after 1968 there were no more National Socialists in the Federal Republic of Germany. Oh, I didn't say that. No, of course, but for me, it was astonishing to see how many things still were not processed in West Germany. For example, generals who still served in the army or street names. It was much easier and a much faster process in East Germany to rename streets than it was in the West. Or the glorification of the people who wanted to murder Hitler. Just in the recent years, it became obvious that they were not people enthusiastic about democracy or human rights. They were anti-Semites. There were people who were militarists and so on. And one more example, the process of reconciliation is never finished. It is not black or white. I think that 1994 or 1995, there was this Wehrmacht exhibition of the Hamburg Institute of Social Research. It was a traveling exhibition shown in many towns and cities of Germany. And I don't know which cities showed this exhibition, but in some cities there were protests against this exhibition. And this made it obvious to me because, of course, it belonged to the standard of the GDR school education that the Wehrmacht was part of the criminal National Socialist regime. And and of course, there can be criticism against this traveling exhibition, but to question this general narrative was astonishing to me. That was in 1994 or 1995. And to say that the Wehrmacht was not part to the National Socialist crimes, that was unbelievable for me. But history is never easy, and we have to be aware of the complexity. And sometimes it is good to see different points of view. I see the GDR also in a discontinuity. Even when we talk about the uniforms of the National People's Army, which were quite similar to the Wehrmacht's uniforms. So there are similarities which we can see, also a sort of Prussian atmosphere that existed in the GDR army. But the other side is not solely, not exclusively positive. Of course, one German state was a dictatorship, the other was a democracy. This is clear and nothing we want to discuss about. But I still think that we still have to deal with the history of both German states.
Capdepón, there's a question from the chat. He says, family histories are ambivalent. At the same time, we're talking about looking back at a historical truth. Do the panelists see a certain friction here, leading to a situation that large parts of the population aren't actually reached by attempts at official reconciliation? Yeah, it's completely right. Family histories are hugely complex, especially after a civil war, which corresponds to a rupture that goes through the whole of society. So these families very often are torn, really. So these family biographies, whole families were broken apart politically, ideologically, and so on. So these are also factors that might tempt us to keep silent on certain things. Nevertheless, this question, historical truth, that probably goes back to civil society organizations that have made this term their own. It's a term, sorry, the Spanish term. It's about historical remembrance, really. Historical remembrance, that's the name of the reconciliation movement, shall we say, in Spain. So that they only ever reach part of society. Yeah, it's very difficult to generalize. I would say, even though not everyone perhaps is reached by this, these remembrance movements that are very heterogeneous, or have been in Spain ever since the year 2000, I would say that they are active in many different spheres. And I would say without these grassroots movement, hardly anything would have been achieved. So it's also about personal histories, family histories, confronting your parents, for example. But it's also about identifying those who disappeared, who are buried in mass graves, for example. That was the starting point for the development of the remembrance movement. And yes, of course, that's closely linked to family histories. It's often about searching for grandparents that were buried in places unknown, or other relatives. So yeah, that's always linked to traded traumas that have been passed down the generations, sure. So I would say these remembrance movements or remembrance policies that is supported by civil society, that's essential, even though it can probably never reach everyone in a society. I would say it's nevertheless essential, because without such civil society movements that now exist throughout Spain, actually, also in very small villages, everywhere there's an association somehow, perhaps wanting to create places of remembrance, or looking at local history, or are looking to have road names changed, for example, all those kinds of things. And mostly it's about searching for people who disappeared. So without them, this new remembrance legislation would never have been passed. So we do need pressure from civil society, definitely. Mr. Mbatha, there's a question to you. A very brief excursion to the former GDR, because you studied in Jena. Did you ever experience racism? And the question on South Africa. Today, do all groups in society have the same opportunities, not just on paper? Or is there still a concentration of wealth amongst the white population? And who actually determines the discourse in South Africa? So that's a question from the audience.
I must tell the truth. My experience of living in the GDR was such that the Friedrich Schiller University had students that came from many countries, from Africa, Mali, Nigeria, Madagascar, Mozambique. There were students from socialist countries, then Hungary, the Soviet Union, and the different republics, Belarusia, and so on. Then we had also students that came from Western Europe, from Britain and the US. It was an eye-opening experience for me, because I had never lived in such a society. I came from South Africa, where I lived among Black people only because of the situation here in South Africa. So to that extent, I can't say I ever experienced racism in the GDR during my time. There were incidences, and they were very good experiences for me, because sometimes during the students' holidays, we went to what we called Arte Einsatz to help in the what you call it now, to help with potatoes, apples, and so on. They're collecting the ripe vegetables and fruits. So during that situation, then you had people from the villages that came to you. They wanted to touch you because they had never seen a black person. They wanted to touch you, feel your skin, and touch your hair, and so on. People, I know that we had many African students that said, no, why do you allow these people to do this? This is racism. I said, no, I don't think it's racism, because these people have never interacted with people who come from Africa. Maybe it's a chance for them, you know? Yeah. Anyway, in the bars, when you went to the bar, you'll find some people, when they are drunk, you know, and they will say, hey, you Africans, what do you want here? You know, then you'll take it as a brawl, something like that. Thank you for that question. The situation currently in South Africa is such that, because I think the ANC, the governing party of which I'm part of it, has failed to deliver specifically on the economic side, that of creating opportunities for most Black people to also come into participate in the economy. Many people are seeing that as a failure of government, but also they are saying it's because also white people in South Africa are failing to change, to see that they should also help in changing the situation of Blacks. So to a great extent, what we wanted to achieve by having this new constitution to create a non-racial and non-sexist society has been work in progress. When I say work in progress, is that we have not achieved that. That's why, because you take spatial spaces where Black people still live in townships like in Soweto, and then you have Sentin and so on. The separation is still very visible to anyone coming to South Africa, that you find places where only whites live, or majority whites, and only Black people. So until we have addressed some of these contradictions, there can be no deliberate move towards consolidating reconciliation. So you still have racial incidents that take place in society.
Und damit kommen wir auch fast schon zum Schluss.
Okay, well, that nearly brings us to the end of our panel, but it's probably true to emphasize yet again that there isn't a single factor that enables a society to leave behind a dictatorship and to then move towards, a better future. Also with respect to politics and democracy. But could I maybe ask all our panelists to say in a single sentence, what is the one ingredient that is a must-have What's the one thing that needs to be in there so that a society actually does move towards transition? I'll start with Marina Frenk. Okay, well, I would actually go back to the beginning and the three terms of system, idea, and sense. Every system begins with an idea that is supposed to lead to a certain solution, and every system at some point loses its purpose, I would say.
Sagen, man muss Systeme
So
grundsätzlich.
I would say that systems have to be rethought very fundamentally and often, ideally every day. Then there's a chance of overcoming them. Ms. Capdepón. Gosh, that's a very good final question. I want to emphasize that the reconciliation processes can never really be fully completed. For processes of transitional justice or reconciliation generally, in the sense of a democratic remembrance culture, they need to allow for pluralistic discourses. They also need to actively support dialogue, that former opponents sit down together, move towards each other, and find commonalities. Look towards the future together as a basis for living together in peace. Yeah. Mr. Mao. Yeah, I would agree with Ms. Capdepón. I think you need to somehow empower large parts of society and enable them to see themselves as political subjects and to intervene also in the processes of transitional justice and to bring to that process the diversity of their experiences and origins. Okay, and Mr. Mbatha.
The most important thing that I must say is that reconciliation is very, very much important. The recognition that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Blacks, whites, Indians, this South Africa is ours, and only this can determine a better future for all of us.
Und das war das Schlusswort.
Wonderful. Those were great closing words. Thank you very much, Mr. Mbatha, for those closing words, and thank you for your closing statements. And that brings us to tomorrow's events. Tomorrow we'll be talking about revenge or reconciliation, the right to the truth, daring to step away from the past, and last but not least, tomorrow afternoon, reconciliation, a never-ending path, or the future of reconciliation. We look forward to that. Once again, thank you very much to all of you, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.